Thank you, Lisa, and thank you for the introduction. And thank you for everyone who's here. I mean, for me, even just being in the last couple of sessions, already inspired, but I'm very excited and happy to be sitting here next to Michael Roth, the chairman and CEO of IPG. And what I think is interesting about what I hope is interesting about the conversation we're about to have actually starts from this morning's session. There was a young woman who stood up and said, yeah, but what do we do if our ECD or our managing director or one of the leaders isn't in support of this or doesn't understand their own bias? And the wonderful thing about what I think the conversation we're going to have is that it is about from the top down, right? How do we, at the holding company level, start to really create real change? And I think IPG has been, from very beginning, thought it was so incredibly important to make sure that we have representation and equity from both a race and gender perspective. So what I'd love today is to be able to give everyone in this audience real tactical ideas to take back to your own organizations. I want us to be able to learn from Michael, as well as hopefully be inspired by the conversation, but walk away with one, tangible ideas, two, also an understanding of some of the stumbling blocks and some of the challenges in doing this. This is not necessarily easy. And three, to talk about all of the work that we need to continue to do. This is not going to be, we do not want this to be something that's just a hot topic right now, but rather there is still work to do, and we're going to talk about that as well. So Michael, thank you for joining us here and having this conversation. And I'll start off by kind of talking about some of the successes that IPG has had. So I mean, IPG, some of the standout accomplishments. In the US, 43% of your senior management and executives are women. And there's more. And there's more. 52%. And there's more. 52% of in the US, 52% of managers are women. 3 out of 9 members of the IPG board are women. You have also consistently always tied your diversity goals to the compensation of your senior leadership. If there's anything that anyone in this audience takes away in terms of an actionable thing to do at your own organizations, there's one right there. How you tie the business performance of your leaders to your diversity goals. What's also been interesting is some of the initiatives that you guys have started that I think have made real progress in this field. So we've got the IPG Network Diversity Council. So these are CEOs from IPG units that meet 3 times a year to talk about company-wide and agency-specific programs. Again, something you guys can just take back to your organizations right now. You also have the Interact Associates Fellowship Program, which is an initiative that seeks to recruit, retain, and develop multicultural talent. And that's almost a decade old. That is not something that just recently started. They've been doing that for over a decade. I have to ask you before we even go into here, just as for myself, of having spent 20 years in creative agency world, being oftentimes the only woman of color in the room, I just want to ask you, you've been so consistent for so many years about being passionate about this. You talk so often about the business case for it. But I also just want to hear from you, what, from a personal perspective, has made you so passionate about this, made you so consistent, and made you doing this way before it was fashionable to start pushing for representation?
All of that. Okay. First of all, there is one takeaway, and it's very important, and I tell this whenever I talk to young people who want to come into our business, or anybody in any business, is that if you find yourself associated with a company that doesn't stand for the values that you have, and you feel uncomfortable in that environment, you should go elsewhere. And that's a significant point. I told that to my kids when they were starting their careers and so on, because it's so important to feel comfortable in an environment that you're in, and it's more important that they have the same values that you do. This way, you know that when you're going to make decisions, and those decisions from your gut are the right calls, you will feel comfortable in an organization that values your input and values your views on different perspectives. Because if you're not in an organization that follows that kind of culture, then you should go find an organization that does. And frankly, that is why I've been so passionate about that since I joined IPG. I was on the board of directors of IPG, so I didn't come here when I was a kid starting out in the business. But it's been true for all the companies that I've been associated with. And from an IPG perspective, what was so important to me, frankly, the first time I met the teams at IPG was the lack of diversity in the room. I mean, the first thing I did was meet all the CEOs and bring them into a room and talk about, who I am, what am I doing here? And they were all white males, and they were all white males that didn't get along with each other. Of course, they all competed with each other, but they all had this advertising perspective, okay? Me, I was an outsider, so I didn't know from the industry. All I knew is I grew up in Brooklyn. I grew up in a diverse neighborhood, and my family values were inclusivity, and so it was common nature for me to be around a diverse setting. And even when it came to women, my mother, frankly, some of you may have seen this article, and in it, she pointed out that my mother was a bookkeeper, my father was a lawyer, so I was both, and because I didn't want to insult either one of them. But my mother was actually the bigger breadwinner in my family, and she was the one who helped me when I needed financial assistance, for example, when I went to law school. So it was not uncommon for me to have a very strong woman who was responsible for financial of the household. So this was just how I was brought up, and I had a pretty powerful sister, personality-wise. So, I was always around strong women, and I grew up in a diverse environment. So this was second nature to me. So when I came to an organization that was being basically run and operated on a day-to-day basis by white males, I felt there was something wrong with this picture. And I had experienced that in the prior career that I had in a financial service organization, which frankly was the same thing. So I had to change that. So I've always done that in my career. And the reason for it is not that it's just the right thing to do. It's the right thing to do from a business perspective, because, especially in this business, I mean, you're trying to communicate with a consumer. Your consumer is more likely to be a woman, and people of color and diverse individuals are the consumers. And if you're representing your clients and trying to get a message out to those consumers, if you don't have that perspective sitting in the room, then you're not going to be able to communicate appropriately. So from a business point of view, it makes sense. And again, the statistics show that in organizations that are diverse and have inclusivity as part of the DNA outperform. And in case you didn't notice, we're outperforming. And it's not by accident that when you look at those statistics, we do a lot of work on comparing our statistics, and we don't do it just to the industry. And you know the reason why we don't just do it to the industry? Because we know we look better than the rest of the industry, but that's not the standard, because frankly, our industry stinks when it comes to diversity and inclusivity. So we actually compare ourselves to our clients who are doing a much better job. So all of that is the reason why I'm so passionate about it, and it's common nature, and I think it's become part of the DNA of IPG.
So for those in the room who are leaders within agencies and are looking around, and similar to the experience you had, where you're looking around, you're like, you know what, this is not reflecting the world we're living in. Where do you start? Where did you start with IPG? What were the first couple of initiatives that you pressed forward that allowed us and allowed you to get to where you are now?
So we have in our company what we call business operating reviews for all our different networks and businesses, right? So I brought them all in and started talking about business, and I asked them, what are they doing about diversity and inclusion? And they looked at me like I had two heads, and they then said, well, we belong to this organization, we come to the 3% Club. It wasn't in existence at that time. But they listed all the organizations that they belong to, and I said, you misunderstood my question. I asked you, what are you doing about it? Not just what organizations you belong to. And no one had an answer, because they weren't doing anything about it. They thought they would check the box. They'd say, look, we go to all the meetings, we participate, and we're doing our job. And yet the population didn't reflect any of that. So what was clear to me was that we had to change. And clearly, in this business, and a lot of businesses, accountability is what drives business. So the first thing we did was put in accountability for the CEOs to be accountable for success in diversity and inclusion. So, and you know, you treat it as a business proposition, you get a lot more attention than you just saying this is the right thing to do.
Yeah. So I mean, again, big takeaway for anyone in this room, how you immediately make your leaders accountable, or look at yourself and how you can make yourself accountable from a business perspective.
And by the way, and hold them accountable. Don't just
hold
say,
them, yes.
Just don't say you're accountable.
Hold
I cut people's incentive comp if they don't perform. And if you want to get someone's attention, you tell someone that the reason, you know, there's a formula, and when that formula comes out and they're entitled to X amount of dollars, if you cut that by a couple $100,000 in some cases, and you tell them because you missed on one of your objectives, and they look at you like you're funny, what do you mean? That's how you hold people accountable.
Okay, so let's say you're an agency leader not within IPG, and you want to make sure that you have equal representation, you're fighting for diversity and inclusive environments, you're trying to push progressive initiatives like pay equity, but the holding company says no because they don't want to make the other agencies look bad because they're not doing it. What counsel would you give those agency leaders? Again, not obviously what happened in IPG, but how should they go about that?
Well, they belong at IPG. They're obviously at the wrong holding company, okay? It's pretty obvious. But look, I mean, it's a business. If you approach this as a business perspective, it becomes a lot more logical. Think about, you know, we started, you talked about things I'm proud of. One of the things I'm most proud of, we started the breakfast in Cannes, okay? I'm just curious, how many people have been to our breakfast in Cannes, okay? When we started the breakfast in Cannes, we had 50 people in the room, and the topic was creative women in our industry, or better known as the lack of females in our industry doing creative work. And that was the topic at our first breakfast, 50 people. And the last breakfast we had in Cannes, we turned away 300 people. And it was in a huge room. We had hundreds of people in the room because we're addressing a serious issue in our industry. And we started with women representation. And then we obviously expanded it to inclusivity overall. And frankly, we not that we're giving up, but we're doing pretty well on the female side. And I think that's just fantastic. But we're actually doing better on people of color. But some of you have heard me say this. I think at the 3% Club in Chicago a couple of years ago, I was one of the speakers, and I changed my whole talk because it was supposed to be talking about women and how we're doing so well on women. And I looked at the room as I'm looking at this room, and I don't see a fair amount of people of color. And I'm saying, you know, we have a lot of work to do here, and we're missing a huge opportunity. Yep. So, you know, we've been focusing on people of color in terms of representation in our company. We actually have a 25% representation, which is probably double or maybe more than our industry, but it's significantly lower than other major corporations in the United States. So, you know, why is that? I mean, so that's what we're focusing on. And by the way, I'm probably getting away from your question.
No, let's do it.
The thing that bothers me more about it, Haida always gets a kick out of when the first time I raised this was, I'm not talking about numbers. I'm talking about assimilation in our business. Because as a practical, we had these awards recently. Some of you heard Haida earlier. And at the awards, I brought up this notion of tokenism versus assimilation. And I remember looking out at the audience. I said, the problem with our business right now, when we talk about people of color, it's checking the box. Mm-hmm. And that is, we need to put some people of color in the room. So we go get people of color, we put them in a room, so the client thinks they have a diverse team, and everybody checks the box, and then when they leave, they're not really part of the team. And when I brought that out at our awards session, I can see the room. Everyone's head was going up and down, and I'm saying, my goodness. But it's true. And if you really want to have an organization that practices inclusivity, we have to practice making everyone part of the process and assimilating everyone into what we do and into the culture of the organization. It's not just numbers. And initially, that's what it turned out to be. People, even when we did an analysis of numbers, because you have to keep track, it was a numbers game rather than a participation and assimilation. And that's when we really get the secret sauce to our business, because the insights. Now, we are seeing on the creative side, creative councils all over the world because of technology. So that when we have a creative challenge, we tap into creative people all over the world. So you get a diverse perspective on creativity, and it's so different. We even have people speaking different languages, but the language of creativity is universal. And the work that we're developing as a result of that is light years ahead of where we were before. So again, this is all from a business perspective, and we just have a long way to go.
Well, and I want to go back to your point around people of color in this industry. And you've said, and you've consistently said, there's clearly a leaky pipeline. And I shared this story with you a couple of weeks ago. About a year and a half ago, I started a breakfast group for myself and other women of color in the industry. And at the time, we were all working within creative agencies. A year and a half later, and we're all senior roles. I was actually managing director of Martin Agency
yes.
in New York, one of the IPG agencies. We had, I think the other women, we had 4 black women, 1 Filipino woman. None of us are working at creative agencies anymore. None of us. All of us had been in the business for over 20 years. All of us had been in rooms before where we would hear panels say something like, oh, well, we just have to find them. We're like, we're right here. No one's listening. Like, well, we're here. And so we left. Actually, so it's interesting to your point. So we left, and we're trying something new. By the way, I hired some of them at the New York Times, so we're still hiring. Side note. And I know that this is so top of mind for you. And as you're working with your agencies, knowing that there's a leaky pipeline, knowing that this is not just about gender but racial as well, and how those two things combine, what are some of the things that IPG is doing with your agencies to enable and start those conversations to ensure that that stops happening? Is it just the awareness building? Are there initiatives that you guys are putting together around this?
Yeah, we've moved on to more of a direct insight and statistical analysis of what we're doing, because we really want to understand how we can change this. And so we have a lot of programs. We have unconscious bias programs. We have training. But the best program so far is the one where we just take managers and just put them in a room with individuals and just talk about stuff. It's not a salary review. It's not a career path review. It's just talking about, how was your weekend? Is it what Haida's panel before? And talk about what's in their mind. And then the story that Haida talked about, where the first time I heard a story like that, of a mother waiting for their son to come home, and their biggest fear was either something bad happening to them, on a violent point of view, or just the police stopping them inappropriately. And you know, the first time you hear that story from someone who is literally shaking when they're telling it because they've experienced it, you become very much aware of how little we really know about other people. Yeah. And it's those conversations that I think we have to have to get that perspective, so that we can then understand what people are thinking. And that's why we have these phone calls on the whole company, to hear people's perspective. Yeah. When horrible events occur, and we want to make sure everyone understands that we're a company that cares about our people, and what's bothering them is something we have to know about, and is there something we can do to help. And just our employees knowing that makes a huge difference. And it, you know, just by sending out notes about horrific events and talking about what we can do about it has changed the culture of our company. So, you know, that's the other thing that I'm particularly proud of, and that is having a company-wide perspective. We just had a meeting of a lot of our global leaders. We have a leadership lab. We bring them all into New York for a week. And I come in at the beginning and I come in at the end. And on the last day, you know, we just have an open Q&A, and someone said to me, this was before the events of the bombing in Pittsburgh and the shooting, you know, of the two black people in the store. They said, do you have a responsibility as a CEO to take positions that might not be correct? That was a question from our leadership lab to me. And that was before. I mean, I'd written a note about Charlottesville a while ago, but this one was before the note about Pittsburgh and the bombers. And my answer to that is very clear, and the answer is yes. I mean, because someone said before, the primary responsibility of the CEO is to make money for the shareholders. That's not my perspective. My perspective is, now eventually it converts to making money for the shareholder, that's correct. But you have to have an organization that people want to work at and clients want to do business with. And if you don't represent certain standards of ethics, morality, have a heart. I think IPG is a holding company that has a heart. Sometimes that may not be true, but I kind of think in general that's true. We do make mistakes. But if you're taking positions on issues, the response that I get as an individual to those letters makes it all worthwhile for me. And it just shows that people care and that people want to be with an organization that has that kind of DNA. Yeah. And that's what we try to do.
When we talked a couple of weeks ago, I mean, it's part of what you're reinforcing now is some of the counsel that you say that you would give to folks is to listen, and you're saying that. It's about listening. Right. And I think the last panel also talked a lot about empathy and truly understanding other perspectives. The group I was telling you about before, there was a woman who had been at an agency. She has since gone client side. And as we were just trying to dissect ourselves, why are we leaving? And not that we're leaving creative cultures. We're still going to creative cultures, but at different types of organizations. She said to me, she's like, well, I think we have to, our industry in particular, needs to start thinking about this differently. That we need to stop thinking of it purely through the lens of diversity and inclusion, because that's the perspective from the majority. That it's really about the equity and justice. That is from the perspective of the underrepresented. And that's a big shift for us to think through, mostly because most of the agencies are from the majority perspective. But I offer that to us in this room, because when I think about how we stop that leaky pipeline, we have to think about that as well. What does it look like for women of color, for people of color, from people from different class backgrounds? What does equity and justice look like versus just diversity and inclusion where you're welcoming us in?
Yeah. I I totally agree, and that's where the DNA of the organization, when as an organization people understand others,
Yeah.
and feel that and react to it in a true way as opposed to checking the box.
Yep.
Then we're a long way from there.
Yep.
But all we can do is make tools available and have people thinking that way. And zero tolerance is part of it, all right? And zero tolerance is a difficult standard, okay? Because, when we first put in the zero tolerance, the first few were pretty obvious, It's when you get to the gray areas that zero tolerance really gets to be kind of interesting, because there are two sides, there are different perspectives, but in a zero tolerance environment, you got to weigh it one way versus the other, and I think we're sort of in that role now, and there'll be plenty more to come, unfortunately, especially in this industry. But yeah, I think you have to have standards, and your organization has to know that you have standards that individuals have to be held to, and there aren't going to be exceptions. And that, if you look at the history recently of our industry, we're seeing more and more of that, and the levels are getting higher and higher of individuals, and that's, in a way, that that's a good thing. I think we have to be consistent when it comes to that.
Well, and I think that's great to point out too for the room, as for the leaders in the room that are looking to really transform their organizations. These are some of the challenges that do come up, and it is hard, and still being able to stick with it and follow it through. As research will show, that the more the more equality you start to have, the more that you really start to have diverse environments, it also will lead to discomfort. It's uncomfortable to be around people who aren't quite like you. We have to figure out how we make that okay. And I'm curious for you, as you're now looking at such great gender parity, and as you're pushing forth in terms of people of color, what are some of the things that you've observed throughout the network of where there have been challenges and discomfort that you've had to push through, or help your agencies push through?
I think the reality is that there's still bias in this country, and there's still bias at our company. For me to sit here and say we don't have any of that, it would be ridiculous. And I once told a story in one of my former lives. I remember getting a call from one of my agencies. It was insurance, financial services. And I got a call from one of my agencies from an agent, said, I'd like you to come down and visit. I said, why, what's the matter? He says, do me a favor, just come down here, unannounced, and visit. I said, okay, well, this sounds serious. So I showed up at the agency, and they were having Ku Klux Klan meetings in the agency.
What?
Yeah, honest. And this was years ago, and and they had pictures up and everything. I walked in that place, I couldn't believe it, because who knew? And everyone was afraid to do it. So I went into the manager's office. I said, are you kidding me? And he looked at me. He says, well, you don't understand this environment. I said, yeah, I do understand this environment. I want you out of it.
Yeah.
And I just cleaned the whole place out. But there has to be an awareness out there, and it takes people to raise their hand and be comfortable enough to know that the person you're talking to is going to listen, and they're empowered to do something about it. And that's really that's the best we can strive for, because the reality is there are individuals who have those biases, and it's hard to uncover it until something happens.
Yeah,
right?
Yeah.
Okay, you would look at someone and say, oh my God, did that person really say that? And it's happened. It's happened to before, where you'd be sitting and having lunch with some people, and all of a sudden something comes out of their mouth, and you sit there, you go, oh my goodness, where'd that come from? And so think of that in a work environment, because it's sitting out there, and people have to be comfortable to, when it occurs, to raise their hand and know that you're part of an organization that's going to do something about it.
Yeah. You know, we talked a little bit about this in the last panel, but I'm curious for what some of your advice would be to our man ambassadors, our white male allies who, well-meaning, want to ensure that there's real change and transformation in their teams and their organizations, but in the current climate feel a little uncomfortable, feel like maybe they'll say the wrong thing, maybe there might be then a reaction from other people, and so instead, even though they're well-meaning, they're kind of keeping it in, they're not really participating, because they don't want to upset anyone. What counsel or advice do you give for our well-meaning allies who are afraid to say the wrong thing?
You know, first of all, I'm getting to be annoyed that I was originally one of the first man ambassadors, so I had this whole thing to myself. and it's true, right? And I used to use that as a recruiting opportunity, okay? And so, you know, I think it's true. One of the panelists said this. You know, the reason a lot of males come to this session is so they can tell their boss they went and they're checking the box. You know, whether they're really learning something or they're going to take something and come back to their agency or their office and do something different. I think those are the individuals that you want to, you know, have participate. And I think you have to stand for something and make a call.
Great.
I really do. I mean, I've done that my entire career. Fortunately for me, it's worked out okay. But again, it goes to what I said when we first opened up the talk here, and that is you have to be in an organization that you feel comfortable to do that. If you don't have that feeling, you should find an organization that does, because life is too short. You know, you don't want to have to come into an environment that is hostile and you're not being yourself. You know, I can't imagine people who come into work and really they're not their real selves because of it. How difficult that must be. So I think we have to pay attention to that.
Great. So I want to shift the conversation and talk a little bit about the work that we do. I think for probably all of us in this room and in the building right now, we got into this business because we're in love with the ideas that we can create and what we can put out in the world. And I personally feel like we have a responsibility with that. I was talking to my sisters the other day and remembering that every Thursday night when I was growing up, when The Cosby Show came on, we sat around the TV because it was the first time that we saw a black family that was normalized and not just caricatures and stereotypes of what a black family was. And for us, it felt so familiar. And we sat around there almost in disbelief that we were seeing this. Of course, it's a little bit different now with everything with Bill Cosby, but that's how we felt in the 80s. We know different now, but that's how we felt in the 80s. But it was outrageously powerful for us. When I got older, and actually this is the reason why I got into advertising, when I got older, I remember walking up, I grew up in New York City on 103rd Street, uptown. When I was walking to a bus shelter, I didn't call them bus shelters then, I don't know what I called them, but there was this big, huge ad, an out-of-home ad, and there was a young woman who looked just like me. It was someone, I'm biracial, I'm half black, half white, I like to self-identify, but I'd never seen that before. And it was a Levi's ad, and the headline had said, "I can't be prejudiced, I'm mulatto." Yes. And I think I was probably 13 years old, and I stood there. One, my mother told me never to let anyone call me mulatto. Mulatto comes from the word mule, it comes from slavery, it comes from, there's just a whole long history of that. So one, that. Two, just all of the wrong information around because I'm mulatto, I can't be prejudiced. So much about it was just shocking to me that this is now the 90s, that in the 90s that this could exist. And I remember thinking, who came up with that ad? Like, how did someone not stop that from happening, right? Like, and that goes back to the business reasons for this.
Yep.
But I think now of the power and the responsibility that we have in this industry for the images that we put out there. And I know this is very top of mind for you, and I just wanted you to talk a little bit about how it's impacting IPG right now.
Yeah, I think it's very important to our industry. And I'll share a story with you. I was new to this industry, so I really didn't know a lot about it when I was thrown into this job. But one of my worst phone calls ever in my career, I've had different careers, but the worst phone call I ever received was from a client. Called me up, and one of our agencies that happened to have been in India had put together a campaign. Now, they said they put together the campaign because they only wanted to win the award. They didn't want to have it really published. So what they did was they put the campaign somewhere in a small publication. Of course, the idiots didn't really think of the internet and what happens when something, no matter how small, it becomes big. And there were 3 of the most offensive ads I have ever seen in my life that was created. And they use our client's logo, and it was just horrific. And so the client just called me up and just for 45 minutes just ripped me apart. And I just listened and listened. At the end of the phone call, I said, I have to tell you something. You're absolutely right, and thank you for being so kind. All right, which is really what I said to him. And then we proceeded to take a look and find out. So, of course, the entire creative department of that particular agency was terminated immediately. And we put in standards in terms of review processes. But how good is the review process if the people who are reviewing it aren't representative of a diverse world?
Right. Yeah.
Because they have no clue that what they were putting out there was offensive.
That's right.
All right? And then fast forward about 6, 7 years later, I hadn't met that client. And I was at a business roundtable meeting in Washington, and there I was. I saw his name tag, and I walked over to him. I said, by the way, I want to introduce myself. He said, I know who you are. And I said, well, here I am. He says, I wanted to apologize to you. He says, I've never spoken to anybody like I spoke to you. And I looked at him. I said, well, I wanted to apologize again for what had happened. And I had offered to go to their board of directors. I actually wrote a letter to their board of directors apologizing and everything. But just think about if our organization had a diverse group looking at this work and saying, wait a minute, this is ridiculous, That's how you stop it. So that's the original start of my involvement in the Unstereotype program, which we're working with the UN on, in terms of we have to look at the work that we do and think about the impact it has on society and what is it representing and how are people being represented and how are issues being represented. And because of what we do, and it has so much power, for children and for people who don't get to see some of this stuff other than through TV or through ads, we're molding their thought process of what people might look like, how they should act, and what they do in certain circumstances, and what women should look like and how they should operate. People of color, how they should look and how they should operate. And so as an industry, we have a responsibility to really look at the work we're delivering and make sure that it isn't having that kind of effect. And so we partnered, in this case, with Unilever. We do a fair amount of work with Unilever on this, and the UN, and we have a team. FCB is working with us on this, and we're just attacking this whole notion of what the work we're doing and how it's being portrayed in the marketplace.
And as a friendly reminder, if you don't have these stats handy, I will give you these stats. In the US, by 2044, no one racial or ethnic group will dominate. And I bring this up after talking about the work that we're doing. So not only do we want to make sure that we're not in any way doubling down on bias or creating bias and stereotypes, but we are changing. The demographics, the people that will be buying our brand's work and products are going to look different. I think as of 2016, more babies of color were born than white babies. By 2060, the number of Muslims in the world will be equal to that of Christians. As of today, 40% of households with kids under 18 count women as the primary or only breadwinner. So this goes back to the business reasons, but the demographics of our country and some of the demographics of our world are shifting, and we need to stay ahead of that.
Yeah, I mean, it's compelling, and when you look at the numbers on it, it's just compelling. And candidly, if you just look at this room, you can see how off we are in the industry. And I view that as an opportunity. I don't mean to point fingers at everybody, but I really look at this as an opportunity. And it's not easy, okay? It's not easy, and you have to do some draconian things to make changes. You have to, you include a more diverse group when you're filling positions. You just have to. And if you're not going to do it by yourself, we're going to require you to do that. And so therefore, when you have an open position, we have to make sure that certain diverse people are represented in the field of employees who are eligible for that position. So you have to do things to cause change. You can't just stand around and say, this is the right thing to do, and let's all just do it. Because everyone's going to say, yay, let's go. You're going to leave this meeting, and everyone's going to go back and feel, wow, that was powerful. That really was. But what are you doing about it is the real question. And is your organization supporting you when you have to do something about it? So I have to call out Mullen Lowe also, because they did a piece for Unstereotype. I wouldn't forget you. For the UN about Unstereotype, and it's, you can probably see it on as a link to the Unstereotype page as part of the UN. So we're starting to do this stuff, but we have a long way to go.
Well, I actually like ending on one of the things that you just said, especially for in the leadership track, of ending with the idea of, well, what are you going to do about it? And hopefully you're able to hear some of what IPG has been doing about it, but also just real tangible takeaways of things where you can go back to your agency and start thinking about how do we make leaders more accountable, or make leaders accountable, and what we can be doing to really create empathy in the organizations. We have a couple minutes left,
Sure.
So if love to do some questions and take some questions from the audience.
Please. Yes.
How do you take it to ensure that it's not a box-checking exercise? How do you take it from building your organization to be more diverse to being an organization that is inclusive in nature? So the retention piece of it, sorry, I'm loud, but I'm not that loud. How do you take it? Could you hear what I said?
Yeah, I did. Well, no, it's a great question. And by the way you know that is when we do our accountability test, retention is part of that. And I can guarantee you that if it's pure tokenism, your retention numbers are terrible, because people won't stay in their positions. As soon as they can, they'll go find another job. And advancement. So we have what is called a talent review, where each of the CEOs have to go through all the different people within their organization, and part of that talent review is levels and diversity and inclusivity, and where the next steps are. And the following year, we see where those individuals are. And if they're no longer there, you got a pretty good sense that they're not really being assimilated into the organization. They're just being brought on to tick a box. That's the other thing that we compare ourselves to. When we talk about people of color, we look at people of color who are in more senior positions than the administrative staff, frankly, which is where a lot of those numbers get thrown in. So we do a deep dive into our numbers as to how it's represented.
Any other questions?
Well, thank you.
Oh, yeah, thank you so much. Thank you,
Thank you.
Michael. Really appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thank you.
This was great. Thank you.